So, and then hopefully we can share these stories also verbally after we're done with all of our guest speakers. So Michelangelo is going to get started with Central Hudson.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming out today. We've got a jam-packed event. There's a lot to get through. And so we're going to get started here with an overview of Central Hudson as a utility and some of the issues arising from their rate case this year. So we are in the midst of a full-blown utility crisis here in the Hudson Valley. Over the last year, Central Hudson has failed to meet the needs of low and middle income New Yorkers impacted by the pandemic, has used discriminatory practices against non-English speaking customers that are bound to be worsened by the looming utility debt crisis created by the end of the moratorium on shutoffs, which is looming. They keep extending that deadline, but we don't know when it lifts. There will be a debt crisis. And they are also currently seeking to raise rates in this year's rate case only a few months after 1/5 of their customers defaulted on paying their bills. Additionally, we have seen an utter failure from Central Hudson utilities across the state and the state of New York itself to respond to the climate crisis, especially last summer after Tropical Storm Isaiah left over 800,000 people without power and over 40,000 without power in the Hudson Valley alone. All of this is to say that the current profit-driven system dependent on fossil fuels is not sustainable in an era of economic and climate instability. It's high time that we look to alternative models to empower a just transition to renewables and a more democratic and equitable energy system here in the Hudson Valley and across New York. And so tonight we're going to talk about some specifics from recent testimony provided by Citizens for Local Power in the 2021 Central Hudson rate case and the statewide campaign for publicly owned and controlled utilities in New York. So what is a rate case and how does a rate case work? So a rate case is the legal process that utilities must go through to raise rates. It is usually justified by costs like new pipes or infrastructure. And in this case, this year, Central Hudson is trying to justify their rate increase, so proposed rate increase, by a proposal to spend $43 million a year over the next 5 years to replace so-called leak-prone lines. And you can see here a timeline of the rate case, and we are sort of in the middle of this right now, going through a review via the interveners, as well as kind of heading into the summer season where we'll be having hearings that we're going to hopefully be able to get involved in as well here on the ground. And so really the basis of all of the investor-owned utilities in the state, and of course Central Hudson being a corporate monopoly, is profits over people. And Central Hudson is looking to raise rates by 8.5% for electricity and a 12% increase for gas over a 5-year period, which will amount to a $164 a year increase in gas prices for working people. Additionally, every utility is guaranteed a return on equity, which is the return of profit to their shareholders. And this is set as a percentage of their rate base. In their filing, Central Hudson is proposing to increase its return on equity from 8.9% to 9.2%. This will increase shareholder gains in the face of the pandemic in addition to raising rates. This is immoral, like plain and simple. It is insane that they are trying to do this and justifying it in the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of such a severe economic crisis. And so there is a really dramatic debt crisis right now statewide, and that is especially true in the Hudson Valley. For residential customers in the service area of Central Hudson, in October of 2020, over 40,000 Central Hudson customers who were 60 days or more behind in their bills owed more than $24 million, which is almost double what 32,000 such customers had owed only 8 months prior. And for businesses, the number of businesses that were more than 60 days behind on their bills in October of 2020 grew from 853 to 2,113, which is an increase of 148%. And the amount they owed went from $341,000 to more than $2 million when compared to October of 2017, which is a staggering 552% increase. It's also worth noting that the shutoff moratorium that was passed by the legislature for utilities did not apply to businesses. It only applied to residential customers. And so this really is a stunning increase in utility debt during the pandemic, in addition to more than 200,000 termination notices that Central Hudson issued between March and November of 2020. And these termination notices were issued even with the moratorium in effect. So it is our opinion that these notices serve no purpose other than to pressure people struggling financially with the threat of having their lights and heat turned off. And of course, these termination notices and fear tactics disproportionately impacted non-English speaking ratepayers who in the utility service area are more likely to be impacted, are more likely to be low and middle income and more likely to be impacted by those shutoffs or the threat of looming shutoffs. So worse yet is how the utilities in New York, Central Hudson included, have utterly failed to respond to the climate crisis. And so in 2019, New York passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the CLCPA. And this landmark piece of legislation sets important emission goals for the state of New York. With the passage of the CLCPA, New York is required to generate 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040 and 70% of that by 2030. Unfortunately, the utilities and the state of New York are far behind in meeting these goals. Currently, only 29% of New York's energy comes from renewables, with the majority of that being produced by large-scale hydro. And shockingly, like really shockingly, in the year 2021, solar and wind combined only account for a paltry 5% of energy produced in New York. And Central Hudson has pledged to increase its solar capacity by 1.4 gigawatts over the next 10 years, but unfortunately, Central Hudson's own implementation plan shows that they are not making a serious effort to meet their own targets, let alone the state mandate of the CLCPA. So the private utilities are straight up killing us, right? New York's energy system is owned by for-profit corporate monopolies like Central Hudson. Decisions about our energy system are made by for-profit corporate monopolies like Central Hudson. And their goal isn't to run a good system. It's to squeeze us for as much money as possible. And they aren't killing us out of negligence. They're killing us because it makes them billions of dollars a year in profits. And so it's clear that for the state of New York to meet its climate goals, a different vision for energy in New York is needed. And we organized this event to raise awareness for solutions that protect our communities from the greed of corporate monopolies like Central Hudson, energy companies like Dan Scammer, and the climate crisis. And during the remainder of tonight's event, you will hear from activists, candidates, and electeds on how Central Hudson and greedy for-profit utilities and energy companies have impacted their communities and why we need to take our power back. We will also open the floor later tonight to hear from you about the impact that Central Hudson has had on you and your families. But first, but first I'm very excited to announce our next speaker. So Giselle Martinez is a lifelong City of Newburgh resident, first-generation American and daughter of Mexican immigrants. Martinez is an activist who volunteers with several local nonprofit organizations advocating for women and immigrant rights, racial equity and education, and environmental justice. She also has experience working in federal and state government and is currently works for the New York State Assembly. And Martinez is running for Newburgh City Council in Ward 1, which is an environmental justice community that all too well knows the impacts of pollution and Central Hudson's greed. So Giselle, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Michelangelo. I'm very happy to join everyone here today. This is a topic that, again, hits very close to home, and I would love to join in continuing informing everyone in our community about what's really going on. You know, I like to say that time is ticking. We are in a climate emergency and we need to divert from fossil fuels and, you know, be able to fully transition to renewable energy. Fossil fuel pollution already disproportionately affects the working class, Black and Brown communities, especially in cities like Newburgh, where, you know, they significantly increase asthma, cancer, birth defects, and infertility rates. Private companies, corporations here do not care about transitioning with urgency, and they cannot deliver an effective plan to address these challenges of the climate crisis. They continue to rely on fossil fuels that poison our communities and for profit, and they continue to profit despite having cheaper renewable energy options. So I believe that these private corporations continue to exploit residents with unaffordable rates and poor service. Again, the Latino communities account for almost 14% of the population here in the Mid-Hudson Valley, and they definitely make up a big portion of the Central Hudson rate base each year. So currently, Spanish-speaking customers have no option to receive their bills and important notices in their primary language. It's worth noting that, again, these Spanish-speaking customers, when seeking to file for assistance and paying off debts during the pandemic, the materials that the materials for proving that these financial difficulties were caused by the pandemic weren't currently available in Spanish. So again, those filings were necessary for anyone that was interested in being approved for programs like HEAP, and they, programs like that are able to help people pay off debts in the long term. So I definitely believe that all debts should be canceled, the ones that were accumulated during this pandemic. So just one more thing, as citizens for local power have argued in their testimonies, each executive state agency that provides direct public services in New York State is required to offer interpretation services for individuals in their primary language. So these agencies are required to translate vital documents, including public documents that such as forms. And while the Executive Order 26 imposes these standards, it doesn't apply to private companies. But again, public utilities are certainly at least critical for the welfare of residents and businesses. Energy is a good and publicly owned utility system. Energy is a public good, and publicly owned utility systems will allow us to have a say in what kind of energy is used. And it's time that we get rid of these private monopolies and take our power back. So thank you so much for allowing me to speak at today's event, and I hope to hear more from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giselle. And yeah, I just want to note some of the comments coming through on the chat. The utility crisis also aggravates the housing crisis. Using rate hikes to build out fossil fuel infrastructure is immoral. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And we are actually joined by Susie, who is with Citizens for Local Power and some other groups as well, who works around utility justice. Susie, if you are able to speak a little about the kind of work that you guys have been involved in, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susie Jimenez. I'm with Citizens for Local Power, Ulster Economic Justice, and Adelante Student Voices. So Citizens for Local Power is currently one of the parties to the Central Hudson rate case. This is not our first rate case we've been on. But on this one, some of our demands in this rate case is debt cancellation for all. We are a strong believer that stakeholders must pay for the arrears and everything. We're also demanding language accessibility, demanding Central Hudson's full translation of all materials, closed captions on all their videos that they are creating in both English and Spanish, or whatever, in various languages that their customers speak. And we're also demanding right now that the moratorium bill is signed and extended. That is not the permanent solution, but that will allow us some time to really get in there and cancel that debt. So those are a few things that we're kind of demanding right now in this rate case. And yeah, I'll pass it over to you guys. And we're also here to answer any questions, anyone also interested in getting the messages out. So I'll pass it back to you guys.
Thank you so much, Susie. And next we have Bravin from Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, which is another group in our area that does a lot of work around utility justice. And he's going to tell us a little bit about Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson.
Thanks so much, Sarah Hanna, and thanks everyone for taking the time out of your Sundays to be here. My name is Bravin. I'm the political coordinator for Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson. Our mission is to build the power of working and middle-class people in the Hudson Valley. And as has been made clear by the other speakers today, one of the best ways to do that is by democratizing our power grid. We have been fighting alongside our partner organizations, other activists, and elected leaders against private utilities for years, and the predatory practices they continually engage in to squeeze working people. In 2015, we helped lead a campaign to defeat a proposed 17% increase in the basic service charge proposed by Central Hudson. The basic service charge is regressive because it requires each household to pay it regardless of usage. And so that would have been catastrophic for working people. Later that year, we helped mobilize our members to fight against the Public Service Commission's proposed modification to the low energy assistance programs. By marching on Albany, attending hearings, making calls to representatives, and just making our voices heard, we were able to expand funding to $69 million annually and expand the program to an additional 500,000 households. We also fought against discriminatory practices. Central Hudson was conducting illegal shutoffs. They were shutting off people's power in the dead of winter, and primarily in Black and brown neighborhoods. We fought for a statewide investigation into their practices, which eventually affirmed those charges and forced Central Hudson to change their policies. In 2017, we again fought against a rate hike for the basic service charge and prevented it from happening. All of these fights speak to two things. Number one, when working people organize, make their voices heard, and fight against these practices, they can beat the private utility companies. But number two, as long as these private utilities have power over us, they will continue to engage in these predatory and discriminatory practices. And the only way to ensure that every New Yorker has the power they need, we need to pass legislation that weakens and ultimately eliminates these private utility companies to make sure that we have a democratic power grid. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Bravin. And speaking of the power being shut off in the middle of winter, we have Daniel, who's going to share a personal story next. Daniel is with Mid-Hudson Valley DSA and a few other activist groups as well. Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. My name's Daniel. Awesome. He, him. I'm the co-chair of the electoral working group here at Mid-Hudson Valley DSA, but I am also a resident of Montgomery, New York. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what my family, working class family of color, experienced because of Central Hudson. So when the lockdown first started in 2020, like in March, April time, my mom and sister had to leave their jobs at the nursing home because of because of unsafe working conditions, because everyone knows how horrible things were when COVID first started, especially in nursing homes, and they both have pre-existing health problems. So basically they both lost their jobs, and the three of us had to rely on my $200 weekly checks from my part-time job at the Walden Library, which is not really enough to live on. So this was very difficult, especially made worse by the fact that Central Hudson is extremely, extremely expensive. So to try to save money, we would keep our heat off at night, and our house did not have good insulation. So at night, I could literally see my breath, like when I was breathing, because it was so cold in the house. We'd have to like wear multiple sweaters, huddle with the animals and stuff like that to try to stay warm. I ended up joining the statewide utility strike that was organized by the Public Power New York Coalition, just to stand with other people around the state who weren't able to pay their utility bills as well. And it was an empowering thing to be connected to all these people, but at the same time, it just felt horrible to have to fight like that. And you know, we've heard so much testimony from people who have been engaged in these fights and have done a great work, but you know, as long as we have these for-profit utilities, like, it's just going to be fight after fight after fight, and working class people shouldn't have to fight all the time just to survive. It shouldn't be like that. So anyway, Central Hudson. So when I joined the utility strike, Central Hudson would send me a letter every week threatening to shut off our electricity, even though there was a moratorium on shutoffs. So it would be like a big giant thing in red letters that said like warning, or like, you know, and then they would talk about how they're threatening to shut off our electricity. Yeah, it was not fun to open the mailbox all the time and get that. So, you know, basically private utilities are vampires that are driven solely by profit. And the basic idea here is that the working class should have control of the energy grid instead. I don't think that's a controversial thing to believe. So thank you all for doing this and for letting me talk. I will mute myself now.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for participating in that strike. And next up is Julia, who's also going to speak a little bit about her personal experience, and she's also a volunteer with Mid-Hudson Valley GSA.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah Hanna. So I'm a community organizer, and I know a lot of you through various work. Mostly my focus has been sort of like local budget justice, but actually, I think that the reason why I'm speaking on this today is because public power in a lot of ways has been one of my sort of side issues, and was actually one of the things that first sort of brought me into community organizing. It was actually Michelangelo who told me about it for the first time at a local meeting, and sparked me joining DSA. But most importantly, I think what it did was it got me really interested in state level organizing. And made me excited about, especially after, the Bernie Sanders campaign ended, it got me excited about the potential of state level policy solutions to some of our most pressing issues on the level of things like climate, but also things like household budgets. Obviously, I think we all very much believe this idea that, things that are jointly used and needed should be jointly owned, which I think was first expressed by Eugene Debs. And I think we also very much know through personal experience, but also through our work in the community and talking to people, that utilities comprise a huge part of people's household budgets. And certainly over the last year or so, that has become even a bigger portion of people's budgets. I know, for me in my little household, our bill went up by a lot. And I think for most people, it increased around 30% through Central Hudson. Most of those costs were coming through something called a gas delivery fee, which I still don't quite understand. And just to give you context, I looked up my bill to refresh my memory. In January 2020, I paid $531. And so that's for a 2-month period, which is how I get billed. And then in January 2021, I had to pay $833. In March 2020, I paid $560. And in March 2021, I paid $772. So it's a huge increase. And, sort of, I think, through our work, we're very interested in ways to make working families' lives better and less precarious and less stressful. And, certainly utilities are a huge cause of that stress. And one of my sort of favorite pastimes, which I also kind of hate, is monitoring the Beacon, New York Facebook page for sort of malcontent surrounding Central Hudson. And one thing that has been very notable to me, and I'm sure people like Dan Amar Blair who are interested in, what the Beacon locals are thinking, is that people are constantly complaining about their bills going up. I would say that and the lines going down and the power going out for sometimes days at a time are huge issues within Beacon. And Beacon is a relatively, sort of affluent community. So I can only imagine what it's like in other places where, perhaps less is invested in that infrastructure. I also think a lot about, and I'm sure this will come up later through someone else, the sort of impact this has had on people with children, because people have been home with their kids. Maybe they weren't making lunch for their children, but now they're having to, grill up grilled cheeses and heat up soup, and they're using more of their electric stove, or, they're using more of the lights because they're home all day. And so just because of our situation of being forced to be home all the time, we haven't experienced a decrease, we've experienced an increase in electrical use. So I think that a lot of people who maybe even had lost work have been heavily impacted just by having to live in their home more. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, this is probably one of my top 3 issues right now, and it feels very within reach. So I'm really excited that we're meeting about this, getting excited about this big push next month. I know that you all have been doing a lot of work on this, and I thank you for that. And I'm really excited to see what happens next, and I hope we win. We will win. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Audrey has a question there. Someone wants to explain that are rates going up before the rate case process has finished? How does that work? Meanwhile, our next presenter is Courtney Williams. Courtney Williams is a scientist, activist, and community organizer living and working in the Hudson Valley. She brings over a decade of experience researching cancer and the molecular mechanisms of disease to parse the emerging data on the health and environmental impacts of energy infrastructure and shale gas development. She has advised local, state, and federal officials on issues relating to climate solutions, pipeline safety, and fracking infrastructure. She is a co-founder of Safe Energy Rights Group, a coordinator with Resist Spectra, and sits on the City of Peekskill Conservation Advisory Council. Courtney lives in Peekskill with her husband and 2 children, 1 mile from Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant, and only 400 feet from the expanded Algonquin pipeline that runs beneath it. Courtney.
Courtney, are you having some trouble with your mic?
Sorry, no, I'm just having trouble with the sharing of the screen and figuring out how to unmute. So sorry about that, everybody.
No worries.
So yes, thank you for the introduction. I live in Peekskill. My day job, I'm a cancer researcher, but several years ago, I got involved in fighting fracked gas infrastructure because of the expansion of a gas transmission pipeline near my house. So you can kind of track how long I've been doing this by the age of my kids in these photos. But I've just included some of the groups I work with at the bottom there for folks who maybe want to learn more about this issue. So my local fight is the AIM pipeline expansion under the Hudson River and under Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant. On the left, you're looking at an image of a pipeline marker on the Rockland County side, just to denote where the pipeline goes, under the Hudson and then under Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant. Spectra Energy, which has since been bought by Enbridge, decided they wanted to expand that pipeline. And so on the right-hand side of your image, what you're seeing is the path of that pipeline expansion. And it actually now brings it within 400 feet of my children's elementary school. We have the Buchanan substation that provides electricity and power not only to the nuclear plant, but also a transmission line for power to New York City. And then this is my neighborhood over here. So whether my kids are at school or at home, they're about 400 feet from a massive gas pipeline. And now you may have heard that Indian Point is shutting down. A lot of folks think that means, things will be better, safer. Not necessarily. Peekskill is an environmental justice community. We suffer a lot of environmental racism. We have an incinerator plant, we have the nuke plant, we have the gas pipeline, and really we are a model, unfortunately, kind of a poster child of too many cities here in the Hudson Valley that are the subject of environmental racism and kind of show the abject failure that is our current profit-based energy model. So I'm hoping that today I'll disabuse you if anyone still thinks there's anybody watching out for us or looking out for us. I hope to disabuse you of that notion that the government or any entity is watching out for us right now. So I've been fighting this pipeline for many years. The pipeline, we lost the fight. The pipeline is built and is in service. A lot of folks think that closing the plant is going to make us safer, but in reality, it will not, because we have nowhere to store the 40 years of irradiated spent fuel that's been stored, that is at Indian Point. So what you're looking at here is a map of what would happen, not if Indian Point melted down as an operational plant, but just if the irradiated fuel that is stored there caught on fire. And we worked with researchers at the Princeton University Program on Science and Global Security to basically model what would happen here. So they used weather data from different months in 2015 and looked to say, depending on how the wind blows, where would we have to evacuate? And so in December, if the wind blew like December 2015, you could see, here's Albany, all the way up to Montreal would need to be evacuated because of the level of radioactive fallout that would occur. And here's some of the other months from that year. So January, May, we've got to evacuate Washington, D.C. We've got all the way up to, northern New Hampshire. So shutting down Indian Point doesn't make us safe because there's nowhere for us to put that radioactive waste. So how did we get here? How is this the model for how everything goes wrong? Well, all the safeguards and with regulatory entities failed. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration at the federal level failed us. The Public Service Commission, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Public Service, the Department of Health, the Department of State and New York State all failed us. Despite the state of New York acknowledging the risks that this pipeline poses in their own assessment, and despite a Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Office of the Inspector General's internal investigation showing that the approval was reverse engineered. They basically wanted to approve this pipeline expansion under a nuclear power plant, so they reverse engineered their safety assessment to get that outcome. This is a rigged system. We are here because public risk is acceptable in the name of private profit. And I do want to note that this pipeline was approved and majority constructed under the Obama administration. So this is not a Trump failure. This is how this system works. These are appointees of Governor Cuomo and appointees of Obama, so-called progressive Democrats that are basically working under the auspices of pipeline companies and the gas and nuclear industry. So I hope that what you're seeing here is that the closure of Indian Point does not make us safer. And in addition to these risks of the pipeline, it's also making us less safe because it's being used as an excuse to build out fossil fuel infrastructure. As many of you, I'm sure, know, there's Dan Scammer, there's Cricket Valley Energy, there's CPV. All of these are fracked gas plants that are coming online supposedly with the excuse of replacing power from Indian Point, which is not necessary, as the New York Independent Systems Operator has shown. But this is necessary for profit and making the fracking industry profitable. So with that, I'm going to close because I know I'm a little bit over time. If folks want to get more involved, I'm going to drop some links in the chat where you can comment on the license transfer for the decommissioning company that didn't even know there were gas pipelines under the nuke plant when they put out their proposal for how to decommission it, and also how to get involved in some wonky gas planning that's going on at the state level that we need public engagement in. So thank you all.
Thank you, Courtney. And yes, please do post all those links. Yeah, I think that's a really, that's the fundamental problem with these different parties, is that it doesn't matter who's in power if they are all answering to the same forces. I think that's really the reason, we are here. And like Dan said earlier, they just want to make everything difficult. Everything is a fight. So we don't have any choice but to fight, unfortunately. But I'm really glad that we are talking about various aspects of this, because, in the end, I think we want the same goal. So yeah, with that, this is another, in the vein of the same thing that I was saying. Ginger Strand, environmental writer and nonfiction author, is going to speak next a little bit about what was going on in Olive with the Ashokan Reservoir. Her most recent book is The Brothers Vonnegut. Ginger.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to speak, and just tell a little bit of what I hope will be taken as kind of a cautionary tale and kind of an inspirational tale that highlights the importance of taking the profit motive out of our transition to renewable power. So I live in the Catskill Mountains, and towns up here were taken aback and really surprised to learn in January that a California for-profit developer had applied to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for a license to develop a pumped storage hydroelectric plant in the Catskill Mountains. The upper reservoir where they would pump water up when electricity was cheap would be built by damming a valley somewhere in the Catskills Forest Preserve, which belongs to all the citizens of New York State. And as the lower reservoir, they would use the Ashokan Reservoir, part of New York City's drinking water system, the largest unfiltered water supply in the nation, and drinking water for 9.5 million people. New York City was as shocked as we up here were to hear about this plan. And people kind of came together and started asking, why is this happening? Well, it's happening because we need pumped storage hydroelectric power. We need a lot of it as we transition to renewables, because the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. And how do we provide backup power without firing up one of our fossil fuel plants? Right now, the best and pretty much the only method we have for storing energy capacity is pumped storage hydro. So we need to build it. The question is where? Like all renewables, renewables are not free energy. All energy comes with a price. And if you don't look at that price fairly and squarely, you'll never know if it's too high. So the community came together, a kind of unlikely coalition of the Coalition of Watershed Towns, environmental groups in the Catskills, New York City, and everyone kind of strategized together and filed to intervene, filed letters with FERC. More than 1,500 letters from individuals were filed with FERC. And what happened ultimately, and arguing that while we all believe in pumped storage hydroelectric, we don't believe it should happen in the highly preserved wilderness areas that are the top 1% of habitat in New York State. And it shouldn't happen on the backs of 9.5 million people's drinking water. So ultimately, this company, Premium Energy, withdrew their application, and they cited the social impact that their plant would have. I suspect that they'll be popping up again somewhere else. Probably they'll turn next to Sullivan County and to the reservoirs there. And it's just a case of being vigilant, and public power, I think, would help significantly, because when we're citing pumped storage hydroelectric, we should be thinking about all of the other issues: the environment, the drinking water, the watersheds, environmental justice. For-profit companies are not going to do that. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Ginger. Yeah, if you also have any links you want to share about that, please go ahead. And when we are done with this event, we'll make sure to send out an email with all of these links so that you can learn more about each of the things that we are talking about today. And yeah, I think Ginger is absolutely right. They're just gonna pop up somewhere else. So we're just gonna have to be vigilant and see what happens there. So up next, we have Dan Aymar Blair. Did I say that correct? Dan Aymar Blair. He's an activist and politician living in Beacon, New York. As city council member for Beacon's Ward 4, Dan has advocated for stronger environmental protections and reducing the city's contribution to climate change, especially decarbonization and electrification. He has also been focused on police reform, affordable housing, and expanding social services. Before becoming a council member, Dan has been a lifelong activist and organizer, most notably leading the Grannies Respond nationwide caravan of seniors responding to family separation. Dan's activist experience led him to found Article 20 Network, the only human rights organization focused on the freedom of peaceful assembly.
Thanks, Sarah Hanna. So as Sarah Hanna said, I represent Beacon's Ward 4. Despite Beacon's gentrification, there's actually quite a few working class neighborhoods in Ward 4. Ward 4 is also home to Beacon's embattled natural resources like Fishkill Creek, Mount Beacon, the Hudson River, and all the adjacent streams and wetlands. So, you know, my goal as a city council person is to improve the quality of life of my neighbors. But my desire is that their basic needs are met. We have to begin there. So, you know, I come to this conversation, to this fight, informed by my first campaign in 2019, where I heard from a lot of folks, working class folks, about how they're being pinched in every direction, right? So whether it's their housing, electric bill, internet bill, what have you. And I'll tell you one of those stories. I had a neighbor who's a renter, and I was visiting him, and I asked him, you know, how things are going, whatever, and he told me some stories. He said, you know, my landlord just increased my rent $20 a month. And he paused, and then he looked at me, he says, where am I supposed to find $20 a month? You know, and so that kind of story really, really hit me, because it was the kind of stories that you don't hear often in Beacon. But what's going to happen to this guy when he gets an increase in his Central Hudson bill, right? So, you know, they say that, you know, you know, every dollar is a vote, right? Like when you spend your money. But when you have these monopolies, you're being forced to vote every time for a cruel corporation that is a cruel corporation that's committed to fossil fuels. And I don't think most of the people that are spending money on Central Hudson or paying their power bills, that's not how they would vote, right? And so what it all comes down to, and we've heard it said many times today already, is, you know, basic needs cannot be met or be made equally accessible by a private corporation. Central Hudson is a $15 billion company. Its executive suite makes $5 to $10 million each. Their stated goal is 6 to 8% annual growth. And their CEO and their leadership team only talks about climate change when they're talking about opportunity cost benefit analysis. This isn't the kind of corporation you would trust with your basic needs, with your rights, you know? And so between the profit margins, the executive compensation, this all drives the costs up, which limits access. And that is not what we're aiming for in New York State, to limit access to basic needs. One of the things that I've been working on, and Sarah Hanna mentioned it, is decarbonization. Sorry if I'm going a little over. Decarbonization and electrification. When I was first running in 2019, that was around the time that Brookline, Massachusetts and Berkeley, California decided to ban natural gas hookups for all new construction. So in my second city council meeting, I brought it up and I said, can we do this here in Beacon? Because we're having a big development boom here. For anybody who doesn't know, they're building things everywhere in Beacon. And each one of those buildings is new natural gas infrastructure, right? Each of those buildings is going to be burning gas. They have pipes burning gas. And so we looked it up, and the city attorney looked into it. I ended up going on down a 12-month rabbit hole, talking to everybody who will listen. And it turns out in New York State, such a thing doesn't exist. Municipalities do not have the power to limit new natural gas hookups on construction. So, you know, this is all part and parcel to the big fight that we're all a part of. And I'm really grateful for all the work that the Public Power New York Coalition is doing. I'm going to continue carrying on this fight. It looks like there may be some movement in New York State on this issue. So ideally, New York State should just ban all new natural gas hookups to all new construction. I mean, it's unrealistic to continue burning new natural gas when you're trying to curtail your emissions. But it does look like NYSERDA might be working on some stretch code, building code that could do this, but I don't think I think they're a little while from releasing it. Anyway, this is all to say, to meet our emissions goals and to protect working class families, we need to make energy the people's business, and we need to take greed and willful disregard out of Central Hudson out of the equation.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's that's totally fine. It was worth hearing about that. So I think it's okay that we're running a little late, basically. And I think that if everybody is okay with it, we have one more presentation left, and after that we can see if people want to just have an open discussion for a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna try to share my screen now. One second. Can everybody see that? Great. Okay, so next we're going to zoom out from mid-Hudson Valley and look at the whole state for a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, Nobody Leaves Mid-Hudson, Mid-Hudson Valley DSA, and Food and Water Watch are members of the Public Power New York Coalition, which was formed in 2019, resulting from the organizing that happened around some of the rape cases that were going on at the time. So as we reflect on what we've heard so far, these are really the 5 words that we want to think about: efficiency, equity, resiliency, conservation, and accountability. You know, and many of you have already addressed a few different aspects of these 5 things. Here are different private utilities that serve different areas in our state. With a few exceptions of overlap, these large companies have a monopoly of our distribution system. And, you know, whatever we have heard about Central Hudson is generally also true for all these other utilities. And, you know, not even just utilities, but for-profit private companies. But everywhere you go in New York, New Yorkers hate their private utilities, whether it's folks in Rochester or Long Island or New York City. And this is, you know, what we've been talking about this afternoon, right? You cannot fix greed. The for-profit model is directly in conflict with what we want in our energy system. When your very existence revolves around having to show quarterly earnings statements to your shareholders, that means that no matter how many sincere goals you may set, the model itself puts you against those goals. But we can safely claim that these goals have not been sincere. And, you know, and it isn't a hypothesis or theory. This is something we can see explicitly in the history of private corporations. When electricity became available and a handful of powerful people owned these companies, they've always been most interested in how to generate more revenue. So one of the astounding features that we're left with now, you know, of this model is that the more energy people consume, the more profit these companies make. The more unnecessary infrastructure they build, the more they can charge customers. So why in the world would they be interested in efficiency gains that would overall reduce energy consumption? And why would they be interested in conserving our important landscapes from unnecessary infrastructure? We all talk about fossil fuel companies, rightfully so, but let's not forget about the other parties, the privately owned utilities, you know, who have been one of the most powerful oppositions against clean energy policies, especially at state level. During the 80s, the Association of Private Utilities, called the Edison Electric Institute, or EEI, actively worked on repositioning global warming as a theory and not a fact. Central Hudson, Con Edison, PSEG, National Grid, and several for-profit independent energy producers are members of this association. These utilities have also fought hard to protect their monopoly. In New York, they have monopoly over the distribution part of our grid. Historically, they've argued that it doesn't make sense for there to be competition amongst utilities because the distribution infrastructure they own is not the kind of thing you should replicate haphazardly. And that's absolutely true. It is not safe or efficient or productive to replicate this infrastructure just so that more private companies can have a share. But if that's the case, then why is it that just a handful of investor-owned utilities get to own this infrastructure? According to their own argument, it sounds like this infrastructure is too essential to be anybody's private property, not subject to democratic accountability. So the takeaway here really is that the imperative to continuously make profit, Dan just threw numbers earlier about Central Hudson's own goals, that imperative is itself in contradiction to our well-being. And, you know, Michelangelo said earlier, they aren't harming us because they don't know what they're doing. They're harming us because that's what's more profitable. So that brings us to the idea of public power. To put it broadly, Public power is a publicly owned, democratically run energy system. And I saw that somebody asked in the chat, where else it exists in the US. It doesn't exist in like a statewide system, I think, but it exists in little, in clusters basically, and somebody can correct that if I'm wrong. But for example, even in Texas, Austin has a publicly owned utility that not only did not charge ridiculous amounts to their customers, but they actually gave some money back. So to put it broadly, publicly owned, democratically run energy system. But this isn't the goal itself. This is rather the way to achieve the goal. And that goal is to turn the energy system into the engine of transformational change that contributes to our well-being. In other words, we need to reclaim energy as a public good. With no shareholders to answer to, a public utility would answer to only the needs of the people and the ecosystem they need to survive. The investments that go into growing the bank accounts of Wall Street investors can go instead into making our grid modern and reliable, into overall resiliency against not only weather events, but also economic disruptions like pandemics, which incidentally is a result of another profit-led phenomenon of extreme deforestation. Investments can also go into lowering utility bills and creating programs that benefit our communities. Already existing public-owned utilities nationwide are on average 13% cheaper, and the power outage they experience are only half as long. In New York, when New York Public Authority was created in 1931, one of the effects was that it lowered the electricity costs. Public entities are also subjected to higher levels of accountability, for example, labor laws and freedom of information. And I just want to acknowledge what Courtney said, earlier, is that we can assume that nobody is looking out for us, in the sense that just because it's public doesn't mean it comes perfect as is. It just means that we have more ways of, holding them accountable. And we don't have those ways with private companies. Putting pressure on private companies is a much more convoluted, time-consuming, roundabout, and expensive process that doesn't seem to work after all that work. So, New York has tried to make reforms by introducing deregulation and competition, but that market-based process has obviously failed because it turns out that for-profit corporations don't compete by offering the best service or building the best things. They do it by cutting the most costs, and that happens at the expense of our most vulnerable communities, as usual. So in terms of this coalition, Public Power in New York, this legislative session, we are introducing 2 bills. The first Build Public Renewables Act is our focus at the moment. It's just been introduced in the Assembly and will be introduced in the Senate soon. This bill would scale up the generation of renewables in our state by expanding the capacity of New York Public Authority, or NYPA, to do so. NYPA is a publicly owned entity, not financed by taxpayers. It is its own lucrative operation. We feel that it's great at doing what it does, but it needs to be democratized more. And right now it has limited rights on how much it can expand in terms of generation of renewables. And even that right is set to expire in 2024. And there's no way, without NYPA taking the lead in a massively scaling up the generation of our renewables, that we can meet our targets through the insincere and insufficient plans made by the private companies. The implementation of this bill would also create over 35,000 good jobs in renewables and retrofits, with the jobs coming directly out of NYPA being prevailing wage union jobs. By 2025, it would get all state properties to 100% renewable energy and phase out NYPA's own gas plants. It would also ban predatory energy service companies, or ESCOs, that have scammed vulnerable communities into signing up for higher utility bills with misleading marketing and promises of cheap decarbonization. On average, ESCO customers, who are often non-English speaking or elderly, end up paying 17% more. This bill would also require that NYPA deliver a 10-year climate resiliency plan within 2 years of passing and ensure that we begin the process of adequately democratizing NYPA. And our second bill, Utility Democracy Act, will bring the entire electric sector into public ownership by transitioning private distribution utilities to publicly owned entities within 2 years. This would also entail drawing new utility territories based on the ideas of equity and environmental justice, and establish a timeline to scale down gas infrastructure while scaling up renewables for the entire electric sector. As you might have guessed, this is not going to be an easy fight, but it's a necessary fight if we want to take climate science seriously and if we are sincere about making our energy system democratic and equitable. No amount of convoluted, expensive, time-consuming regulations will get us to energy democracy quicker than public power and the removal of basically for-profit incentives. So we need to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Here's a sample of some of the greenhouse gas emissions happening in our countries. Just looking at this picture, we can't afford to basically wait for private companies to figure this out. I mean, they're welcome to try all they want, but that can't be our only plan. So, this is just one of the multiple ways, or one of the multiple pieces, I think, that's going to be part of the solution. So in terms of action you can take, if this campaign sounds like something you want to support, right now we are asking everyone to call their assembly members to sign on to Bill A1466A. On our website, you'll find a link with like a phone script that you can use, and maybe Michelangelo, you can post that in the chat, but all the links that we have been sharing today, we'll make sure to include in our email when this event is over. And we're also doing other phone drives to call other assembly members. So if you're interested in that, definitely email us so that you can join us. Next week, we're gonna try to allocate just half hour daily to make these calls and try to make it a fun group activity. So I'm sure there's gonna be some questions that we wanna discuss. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, on the topic of questions, a few came in that I think are really great questions we should absolutely answer. Gina asked in the chat, should energy consumption be rationed? Why do the wealthy get to consume extraordinary amounts of energy to the detriment of the rest of humanity? So one of the things that the Public Power New York bills address is it establishes a progressive rate structure that will lower rates for low and middle income ratepayers and adjust rates based on your income and the amount of energy used. There are also specific carve-outs for low and middle income customers who may be living in an old house that is energy inefficient. And part of the purview of the New York Build Public Renewables Act is to provide funding for efficiency retrofits to help address some of those older, some of that older housing stock in New York State. So the progressive rate structure in our bills directly addresses some of that issue where you have, again, to the broader issue that's intersectional with the climate crisis is also the wealth income disparity that we see in this country. And our bill does address that in part by establishing those progressive rates. Another question that came in here is, let's see. I'm not sure who Brickphone is. Brickphone asks, I know we were talking about power, but I think this also goes hand in hand with democratizing internet access as a public utility. And this has come up a lot, especially in the Mid-Hudson Valley region and talking with electeds about public power. In the Utility Democracy Act, we have very specific language that provides a pathway to bringing public broadband under the utility system that we establish in that bill. And specifically because all the lines that are laid for efficiency improvements and smart grids, et cetera, is the same infrastructure that would be used to lay broadband and fiber optics. So it's in the bill. We are not specifically addressing it right out of the gate, but there's language to provide a roadmap to getting it under public control as well. Because we do realize that, especially upstate, once you get out of New York and even in New York City, access to broadband and high-speed internet, which is so essential in this modern age, is hard to come by, and there's a lot of discrimination in rural areas in the state because there's not a lot of investment from the utilities on that side of the equation going back into the grid there. Let's see if we have any other question. Yeah, ban Bitcoin mining. I don't think we have that in our bill yet, but we probably should include some language on that.
Robin, did you want to speak about Austin a little bit? I don't know if you heard me. Can you hear me, Bravin?
Oh, so sorry. Sorry,
Did you
Sarah.
say you wanted to talk about Austin a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I that was more so like just saying that, you know, in Austin we had public power. So the utility company was publicly owned, and utility costs were like super reasonable. There wasn't at all any kind of initiative to fight against them. And I think it speaks to the fact that public utilities, while you're still going to be, you know, paying some sort of cost, are much, much more reasonable, don't engage in the same discriminatory practices as private utilities. So I'll pass it back to you.
I do want to ask if anybody has any utility experience they would like to share. If so, just like let us know in the chat.
While we wait for folks to jump in chat, you know, one other thing to expand upon is one of the reasons that we are trying to expand the New York Power Authority's jurisdiction to being able to build and own new infrastructure is almost all of the renewable infrastructure in New York State is under private ownership and is investor owned. And that means that they have to charge a premium on the electrons generated to be able to return a profit to their shareholders. When the infrastructure is owned by the state, they do not have that profit, that margin of profit that has to be delivered back. So that means that they can sell the electricity generated at a much lower rate on average compared to privately owned infrastructure. And in fact, public utilities, I believe nationally, cost ratepayers between 11 and 13% less than compared to privately owned utilities. So it is across the board a more equitable and more affordable solution than going the private route. I see Nicholas is on Stack. And yeah, if anybody wants to jump in, feel free to type Stack or put your name in the chat. So we'll go to Nicholas, and I see Julia has a question.
Well, I guess I was just going to say about my experience. I used to live in California. I had Pacific Gas and Electric, which was in the news not too long ago for causing wildfires. And at the time when I was renting a house with a bunch of other students, our landlord had installed solar panels on our roof. And back then we didn't use, because of the climate, we didn't use very much electricity. So we were giving all this free electricity to PG&E, but we'd still have to pay the, you know, regardless of how much we generate, we would still have to pay the $5 a month connection fee, which compared to Central Hudson is very reasonable. But still, it irked me that we were giving free electricity to the public, you know, well, for-profit Pacific Gas and Electric. So I called them up, and they said basically there's no, you know, the utility commission, the public service, or it's called the Public Utility Commission in California, does not require us to pay you, so we won't. You know, but of course, if you owe us, we'll definitely collect that. You know, so, you know, wrote them a letter, and they you know, they had nothing to say. So that was, you know, while people so then this had this perverse incentive. Instead of designing the utilities to work in the public interest, because everyone needs public power, everyone needs electricity for heat and heating, especially in New York. We have a system where we just pay enormous amounts of salaries, and when they skimp on labor rights and environmental protections and grid, you know, grid maintenance, as we saw with PG&E. And I was really disappointed that the state of California didn't take over PG&E. That would have been a perfect example of creating a large public utility. So unfortunately, I hope we can do it here in New York. Go back to the way it was before deregulation.
And we're gonna pass to Julia, but I just wanted to mention real quick that in Long Island, there's a very interesting fight going on where they have, you know, LIPA, which is the Long Island Public Authority, but they work with a private utility, which is PSEG, right? PSEG. And basically the fight that's going on right now is they want to, you know, that private partnership, not even a complete private entity, but a private partnership is ruining their energy system, and now they're considering options to maybe, making PSEG public and so on. So that would be very interesting to see how that plays out there. Julia?
Yeah, so I don't know if you all have an answer to this, but just kind of being inspired by the Village of Green Island, what would be like the process for making a town or village's energy public and renewable in a nutshell?
I can provide some info on that. So there are two main ways that that's happening in New York currently. There are, as I mentioned in the chat earlier, over 40 municipally owned utilities in New York State, which are really like smaller public utilities. The unfortunate reality is that, especially because of COVID, municipalities do not have a lot of money to be able to afford to take over the infrastructure that's in their service area. And so what's the leading process for providing renewable energy to communities across New York State right now are community trace aggregation programs, or otherwise known as CCAs, and community energy projects. And one of the big issues that exists around CCAs right now is a lack of supply. And the great thing about the New York Build Public Renewables Act is that it empowers NYPA to build a lot of renewable infrastructure. And that means that if municipalities want to scale up their CCA programs or their community energy projects, there will be more supply on the supply side for renewables to be able to power some of those local energy projects. So even beyond the takeover of the utilities in creating these new utility districts, just the Build Public Renewables Act alone will provide significantly more capacity on the grid for local energy projects and community trace aggregation projects.
Yeah, and adding on that, right now, CCAs really have to compete with, private companies to have access to this wholesale energy that's coming out of NYPA. So one of the things we also want to change basically is who can NYPA sell its very good affordable energy to, and we want to include, end users so that they can be, low income families and so on, and also especially towns who want to use CCAs. I think that we feel like those initiatives should not have to compete with, private companies who have NYPA's attention.
So I'm going to pass over to Anthony Grice, who wanted to share some stuff with the group today.
Can you hear me all?
Can hear you just fine.
So first, I want to thank you all for putting on this fabulous presentation. I think it's very timely. I also want to thank my elected officials that are here. Like many of the people that are here, I know, from the various work that I do. And I'm always so happy to see Dan over in Beacon, because I miss going out to dinner with him, and we'll make that up soon. So I do want to introduce myself really quickly, because there might be some people on the line who do not know who I am. I'm Anthony Grice. I'm one of the councilmen at large for the city of Newburgh. I'm also a candidate for Orange County Clerk. What I wanted to mention is, while I haven't experienced it currently, as a teenager, as a young child and teenager growing up, I definitely had situations where we did not have electricity. So I know how disruptive that can be to a person's life, to a student's life, to my parents' lives, and everything else. And that experience still sticks with me, and it is part of what drives me for some of the things that we're doing. I just wanted to mention really quickly also about what the city of Newburgh is doing, realizing that that is not enough, but it is what we're doing. We just recently, I led the effort to have community choice aggregation. So that legislation passed and is just now starting. I also led the effort to have our street lights taken back from Central Hudson. The clarity on that I want to mention, though, is that they still own the poles. They still provide the electricity to us. So while we got the street lights back, and that will save electricity and save our taxpayers and the city money, we're still tied to Central Hudson. Also, another thing that we are pushing with them is they have the rights to dig up our ground, when they need to change the gas lines, the electric lines. And what they've been doing is, when they dig up the ground, only paving half of the street. So it just makes the city of Newburgh look a little weird. And of course, the residents blame the city of Newburgh. They don't realize that it's Central Hudson doing that. So we're pushing to have them pave the whole street when they dig up, and to put a 5-year moratorium on if we just pave the street, to not, unless it's emergency, to not dig up under our ground. There was the other thing that we're pushing, because in the city of Newburgh, some of our housing stock is old. So we're pushing for the stretch code. Ramona Monteverde is going to take that lead on that. But, I'm definitely in collaboration with her. There is something else that I feel like I'm missing, but if any of you, I'll leave my email and contact information, my phone number in the chat. So if any of you ever have some ideas, or you want to say, hey, what is the city of Newburgh doing about that? Please feel free to reach out to me. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anthony. Does anyone else want to jump in with any stories on your interactions with the utility company, stories about the climate crisis, anything like that? Please feel free. This is, I think we have a few more minutes here to do some Q&A. So if anybody wants to get a question answered or throw a comment in, now's a good time. And while we wait for anyone maybe to jump on the stack or ask a question, I will note that we will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who RSVP'd for this event with next steps for getting involved in the public power fight. We'll be using that list to keep folks updated on the rate case proceeding. And so this is really just the first step of getting more involved in this, and we hope that folks will follow us through this effort in this campaign. I see Gina has her hand raised, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy there are so many people that are concerned about these issues. I've been concerned about them for a very, very long time. I am thrilled that the world is realizing that the burning of fossil fuels is deadly to the planet. Therefore, it looks like in the short term, we're going to be moving to more consumption of electricity, things like electric vehicles, and battery storage, and renewable sources of electricity. But it's going to take a little time to get there. So our job, your job in this generation, is to figure out how to bridge that process without destroying the planet, or before the planet gets destroyed. And at the same time, enabling human beings to get to utilize the energy that they need to sustain life on this planet in some kind of an equitable manner, to enable all of them to participate, not just the rich who can go fly to Mars and live there where they're going to generate water and oxygen out of who knows what. So it's important to keep all of these factors, I think, in mind, realizing that we need ultimately to reduce the consumption of electricity and all forms of energy. And yet, in the short term, there's going to be an increase. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick reply on that. New York State has pretty horrible efficiency. We have really big efficiency issues at large. And a lot of that stems from the way the grid is set up right now with transporting electricity generated upstate. So a lot of the renewables that are upstate, whether it's wind or large scale hydro, there are a lot of bottlenecks in the grid that make that inefficient right now. So the Build Public Renewables Act goes a very long way right out of the gate of addressing some of those efficiency issues. And that is conservation is a very clear aspect of getting to the goals of the CLCPA. Without good efficiency planning and retrofits across the state, it'll be very difficult to reach those goals. So it's definitely part of the mission that we're setting out to address some of those issues.
Martin has his hand raised. Is he here? Martin?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for all this this wonderful presentation and all this great info. I just wanted to speak a little bit on my recent experience with trying to get away from the ESCO that I was in, Green Mountain Energy, which is it turns out just an intermediary that's another corporation trying to make money off of getting us our our basic needs met, which was pretty horrible to learn, because I first signed up for them because they wanted to supply renewable energy, and I was interested in sourcing my energy from renewable sources. But so I recently signed up for the CCA based in City Beacon, where I live, which is Hudson Valley Community Power, and then I found that I had a host of choices for where I could get community solar from, which was very fascinating to go through and learn about. And in the process, I learned that the reason that Nexamp, one of the many options for supplying community solar, was hounding me with print ads, with Instagram ads, with Facebook ads, is that they're owned by Mitsubishi, and it's just another form of corporations trying to add to their bottom line, their profit line. So I'm really hopeful that this push for public power is gonna resolve at least some of these issues, hopefully all of them over time. So thanks again for all your time, everybody who spoke.
Thank you, Martin. And I just wanted to add that, yeah, we don't need middlemen who are just buying energy and selling them for cheaper. What we want to do is you just buy directly from, a public entity, ideally, who's making it. Yeah, so I think that let's define the renewables that we are using. I think that we recently made sure to use the definition that's being used by NY Renews, right? Is that right, Michelangelo?
Yeah, and just to be very clear, so like I think there's a lot of confusion, and I think Courtney could definitely speak to this around decommissioning Indian Point, and what a lot of the frac gas companies in New York State, including Danscamer, are trying to sell the public and the Public Service Commission to get approvals. And that is that there are technologies like green hydrogen that will allow the frac gas infrastructure to transition to a carbon neutral technology. All of that is BS, and in fact, a lot of the justification for the pipeline expenses in the Central Hudson rate case are tied to the fact that they want to transition to hydrogen fuel with their pipelines, which is currently, there's a lot of issues with the existing pipeline infrastructure not being compatible with using hydrogen gas. So there's like all of these compounding expenditures that make no sense. And so one of the things that we wanted to be very, very explicitly clear about in our bills when we wrote them is defining what counts as a renewable. So the Build Public Renewables Act defines renewables as being solar, wind, geothermal, and heat pumps. It does not include biofuels, nuclear, or hydrogen. So it is very explicit on renewables that have the lowest amount of impact on the environment. And I believe we aren't even really trying to explicitly expand hydro significantly, because a lot of hydro unfortunately also has significant environmental impacts. So really trying to focus on just scaling up some of that bread and butter renewable energy sources so that we can get more wind and solar specifically on the grid. Again, going back to the very beginning of this presentation, 5% of all the renewable energy in New York is generated by wind and solar combined in the year 2021. And that is almost hard to wrap your head around when you hear how much electeds like to talk about renewable energy, but we are so far behind in getting to the goals of the CLCPA, let alone some of the international and national goals that we have set through the Paris Climate Accords and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
So I think we should try to close at 2:30. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Yeah, let's give 3 minutes more to see. And also, if you came to this meeting directly through a Zoom link and not through an RSVP, but would like the follow-up email that we're gonna send with like all of the summary, then just let us know. I'm gonna drop, I guess, our email.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just email us there if you are not on the RSVP list, but would want the follow-up email.
Niklas.
Yeah, I was just gonna, speak I was just going to say something briefly about like the way that the regulatory system works. Also, is that you know, the utilities, yeah, I think we've talked about this, that have way too much power. Like, so the New York Power Authority has been trying to get permission to do LED lighting projects with dimming. And so LED street lights are an unmetered service by the utilities. So it's just, you know, how many hours of daylight there are, how many hours of burn time there are, and then times the wattage of the bulb. But, you know, the utilities are trying to say that they're, you know, the existing, you know, it has to be utility scale, and that we don't know how good the dimmers are and all this stuff, because you don't want to put a meter on each telephone pole. That'd be way too expensive. So NYPA has been trying to say, like, they have these nodes and these, you know, smart LED lights that they've been working on that are, you know, been doing projects on it, trying to prove that they're like perfectly good for, you know, billing purposes. But that has been stymied. And also the utilities, this has been now, I guess, slightly resolved, but it took way too long to get the CCAs, the community opt out of community solar. So the original way that NYSERDA was selling it was that, you know, you get a community choice aggregation, you get everybody in the municipality, and you purchase local renewable and energy, right? Well, that wasn't possible because the utilities didn't want to deal with that. They didn't want to do, and they still don't really want to deal with it, because I think still they haven't, the PSC has not approved, because utilities complain, a single bill. So it gets this super complicated, you know, for energy consumers. And, you know, I think Martin talked about it too, like people who get approached by energy service companies, you know, it's not everybody wants to be an expert on the energy system, especially as it's super complicated, and they make it specifically super complicated in order to, you know, increase their profits. Like this whole thing in the solar system, they moved from a very sensible kilowatt hours or a kilowatt hour to the value of distributed energy resource, which solar developers hate it because it's super complicated, and the value depends on where it is in the grid, and like all sorts of complicated, it's just a complicated nightmare. Whereas, you know, that's not really going to help, you know, the residents of New York. It's not going to help the state. It's just going to help the people that have the means, and the lawyers and the accountants to figure out how to game the system, that they're of course going to make sure it works for them and not for anybody else. So, you know, definitely need to go towards a public system where we have democratic control and make things a lot simpler, so that, you know, people can get, you know, free electricity maybe, you know, in the future, you know, if you're using regular amount.
All right, thank you everyone, especially all of the guest speakers who agreed to talk on a Sunday afternoon over Zoom. Yes, glad that everybody was able to make it. Thanks for joining us, and hope you stay in touch so that we can fight this fight together. Not going to be easy, but we'll keep fighting. So yeah, thank you everybody.